Hey there. If you're enjoying the show, please leave us a rating and review on whatever podcast app you're using. It would really help spread the word about the show. Thanks and happy spelling.
Hello and welcome to Dispel Magic, the podcast where we overthink the impact of magic on the worlds of D&D. I'm your host, Benjamin, game designer and writer. You might know me as Sterling Vermin or the Sterling Vermin Adventuring Company.
And I'm Dane, a dungeon master, a podcaster, and a voice actor. And you may know me from the Dispel Magic podcast that I'm on right now.
I hear that's a good one.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
Tell your friends.
Today, we are going to be talking about the spell Detect Poison and Disease.
Yawn.
Yeah. Kind of a sleeper hit.
Don't tell. Maybe you haven't heard about this one, but it's a little something we like to call Detect Poison and Disease. Benjamin, I got to tell you, I have never taken this spell, and I
don't know if anyone has.
In the whole history of Dungeons and Dragons, this spell has never been taken by a first level new player. It's boring. It's tedious. It doesn't do anything, but let's run down the specifics anyway. Yeah. Detect Poison and Disease is a first level divination spell with the ritual tag available to cleric, druid, paladin, and ranger. It takes an action to cast. It has a range of self and a duration of 10 minutes. Specifically, the spell text says, for the duration, you can sense the presence and location of poisons, poisonous creatures, and diseases within 30 feet of you. You also identify the kind of poison, poisonous creature, or disease in each case. The spell can penetrate most barriers, but is blocked by the classic 1 foot of stone, 1 inch of common metal, and a thin sheet of lead, or 3 feet of wood or dirt. Benjamin, is that kind of standard, the 1 foot, 1 inch, all that jazz throughout the spells?
It's definitely on some other spells. Like I think Detect Magic has that limitation, and there may be others like Detect Traps, but also you should never take the spell Detect Traps. But yeah, we'll
get into that later. That's another episode.
That's definitely an inherited kind of concept that it can penetrate barriers, but then there's like these very specific
Superman rules,
lengths, of different materials that end up blocking it.
Kind of silly, I think.
It is a little silly but
they need those restrictions so that people aren't like, I see it on the other side of the world. I see it through the world.
Well, but this only goes 30 feet.
Yeah.
So that's not a thing you would worry about anyway. This is more like, I guess, just for the DM to come up with like really silly situations where it doesn't.
It's kind of like gotchas,
I think that's basically it. Yeah.
Gotchas, or if they want to withhold information, they're like, well, the box is lined in lead. You can't see it.
The other thing is that it opens up the possibility of, and I hadn't thought of this until just now, if you're carrying around a poison on you, you would want to carry it in some kind of vial that's completely surrounded by lead.
Yeah.
Because
or
then it's
3 feet of wood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. That would be hilarious to see somebody walking around with like this giant block of wood, because it would have
around
to
their neck.
At least like six feet in all directions.
Yeah, that's right.
And then
big tall person walking around.
A big tall person walking up the 6 foot square.
Okay, well,
of wood.
Right off the top, we do need to do a bit of a content warning, because we are going to be discussing diseases broadly, and we are in the midst of a global pandemic. So if these are topics that are something that you are more sensitive to, then please go ahead and skip this up. But back to our 6 foot wide
wood for your drop of poison in the middle. Yeah.
What makes you want to talk about this spell at all, Benjamin?
Okay, so the reason I want to talk about this spell is because, like you indicated earlier, Dane, this is probably a spell almost no one has ever taken in their life, because it's not something that in the midst of adventuring comes up often enough that this is what you'd want to have prepared.
Well, this is kind of, it feels almost like more of one of the plot spells, right?
Yes.
It's either a plot spell or it's a function spell. I do know one person who took this spell.
Okay. Out of how many D&D players do you know?
Of the ones that I've DM'd, probably like over 20.
Okay, so out of 20 people, you know one person.
It was my mother.
The spell. Okay.
The one time she played D&D, she played a half.
Would you call her a savvy player?
I would say that she is a from the hip player. She played a half orc paladin named Virtue Victorious, whose mission was to defeat evil.
I mean, that's a pretty badass name.
No, and we didn't get into the moral gray area of who decides what evil is, and things like that. It was all very black and white.
That wasn't a conversation you wanted to have with your mom.
Not at that moment in that space, but she did take this because she saw it as a way of finding evil.
Right. Poisoners, people who, I mean, you don't generally associate the use of poison with somebody with a kind of upstanding moral code.
Yeah, an altruistic, like our benefactor, the poison maker, is here to give the proceeds of this function to the orphans, and it's all built on poison.
Although even that is, I think we can get to a gray area with that later.
Of course.
So
that we deal in gray areas, yes. Benjamin.
So the reason I want to talk about this is because it's not that great for standard adventuring, but the fact that it exists has a ton of implications about how this world, the worlds that it exists in, should work. Like some other spells we've talked about, this is a ritual spell, which means that it can be cast repeatedly all day long by anybody who's a ritual caster who knows the spell.
Just over and over again. The best job in the world.
Over and over again.
Just every 10 minutes.
And so I think the first thing that will jump to people's minds when they hear that is, I think everybody kind of knows that in ye olden days, kings would have tasters to make sure they weren't being poisoned. You can skip that with this spell.
You just have the cleric who knows the spell to do it every time.
Right. And you don't even have to risk losing somebody like a loyal servant. It's just they cast the spell and can tell you if it's poisoned or not. So the other thing is that not only does it tell you if something is poisoned, it also tells you what kind of poison
it's wild. There's a lot of information.
So it is a lot of information. And I'm curious about how this is actually specifically supposed to work, because obviously some poisons are like combinations of things, and I don't really know exactly how they intend for you to deliver that kind of information. But speaking of moral gray areas, all recreational drugs are poisons. Like this thing would go off crazy in a tavern
for alcohol. Alcohol is poison.
Exactly, because all of the alcohol there would be triggering as poison, which is neither here nor there, but it does make me think that in addition to wealthy merchants, kings, probably crime bosses, using this to ensure they aren't poisoned, it also has like an economic use in people who deal with recreational substances.
Yeah,
they can not only casting the spell do they know that it's a poison, but they also know specifically what it is. I'm just thinking about all the like action movies or crime movies you see where there's the whole scene where like two people drive up in a car and they're like, let me see what's in the briefcase, and they're like test it or whatever.
They put their pinky in there. They don't need to do the pinky thing anymore.
Right. They don't need to do the pinky thing. There's no like little scanner. It's just
like, oh, this is talcum powder. You've given me talcum powder. I can't get poisoned by this.
Whole mess of beer or I don't know. What's that thing, the Khajiit smoke and skooma. Yeah. There's a whole mess of skooma in here. This is what I asked for. Here's your 100 gold pieces or whatever.
Well, and even the more mundane things of just like checking cargo, like what's spoiled coming across the seas, or depending on how industrialized your setting is, you just have a factory worker just sitting there being like, oh, this one's bad, whatever, this edible widget is bad.
I hadn't thought about that, but for sure in every port there would be somebody who goes to each incoming ship and
checks it out. What diseases are you bringing?
Right.
Customs. Like you can't bring that on here. That's going to make everyone sick. What are you doing? Now, if you pay me 5,000 gold pieces, then maybe I'm going to look the other way. And that's what we're going to come up against is the weak link in the chain is, of course, the human factor. They're infinitely corruptible, completely variable in what they can say, what they can do. Zone of truth even is not infallible. They can survive that check and not have to tell the truth. So you're not wrong in that this has all of these impacts, but at the same time, they're places for DMs and players to exploit the details. The devil's in the details.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, pay off the person at the port who cast the spell, pay off the king's tester, whatever else.
And then you get really two testers.
Yeah, like it really well. Yeah, I actually think most like really wealthy people would probably hire two testers who don't know each other and aren't allowed to talk to each other.
they live in separate parts of town. They're not allowed to be on the street at the same time.
Right. Like maybe in areas with really big crime, even their identities are secret, like they wear a mask or something.
Oh, that's a great detail. That's a great story detail, is that like, you know, the detectives, the detectors, detectors, they've got like some crazy mask and they're super important because your world is rife with disease and they play an infinitely important role in the town. Yeah, who knows? There's a disease for all the sea life and they are the only thing keeping your town from starvation, something like that.
And also just so that your detectors aren't targeted for corruption.
Yeah.
Like if you are
cool bitchin' masks,
a wealthy merchant, and you don't want your competition to poison you, you're going to want to keep the identity of who detects poison for you a secret so that they can't outpay them.
Now, this is all poisons, but let's get into the disease aspect of it. With spells like restoration, lesser, greater, what have you, that instantly cure a disease.
Right.
What use is this spell? As soon as the disease is there, you cure it and it's no longer an issue. So why even have this?
The first thing that comes to my mind when I think of this spell, and the fact that it's a first level spell, it's a ritual, so it can, as long as you've got two clerics at a hospital or a temple, basically they always perfectly diagnose everybody who comes in to the hospital or the temple or you know, however that works.
The boarding house.
In our own world, germ theory and how we understand diseases has proceeded really slowly because there's nothing to see really. Like we see the symptoms, but we don't see what's causing the disease. We certainly don't know the specific disease they have. But again,
this tells you exactly what the disease is.
Specifically what disease they have. So if I cast the spell and I see that you have flu and the next day you come back and your family has the flu too, I've got a lot of clues about how the flu spreads. Like
people would just kind of know.
Right. It's not going. Yeah. So it would be much easier to figure out, you know, in our world, somebody might get the flu and it's not as bad, or they don't have symptoms and they're just a carrier or whatever. In this world, asymptomatic diseases, you would still
be able to see.
Somebody
comes to town, they're a vampire. And then the next day their family comes to town and their family is all vampires. They know how it spreads.
I don't know. Is vampirism a disease in 5e?
I think however you want to color it, baby. Okay. Well, that's up to the DM, baby. Lycanthropy, the disease.
Lycanthropy is a disease, I think.
What? Vampires and werewolves, they're the same thing. They're just wolf versions.
That is false, but I'm going to let it stand uncorrected at this time.
Fair enough.
The amazing thing about this that I want to just emphasize is that if you cast this as a ritual, or actually no matter how you cast it, it lasts for 10 minutes. And it's everyone and everything you can see within 30 feet. For instance, if you were having an outbreak of a disease and wanted to quickly find out who was sick and who wasn't, you could cast the spell and have a line of people walk towards you while you walk towards them. And over the course of 10 minutes, however many people you
just clear it out
in that time, you're picking out who has it and who doesn't.
Well, and then you have somebody behind you with lesser restoration just curing them.
I mean, yeah. So I will say I'm ignoring the existence of lesser restoration for the purposes of this conversation because I don't think lesser restoration needs to exist for this spell to still be super important and impactful.
Okay,
lesser
fair
restoration compounds how important and impactful this is, but it doesn't need it to be.
I was saying it just negates it completely, and then we don't even need it. Like, that person looks sick. Greater restoration.
This tells you though who's a carrier. Like, lesser restoration also is not at the time where you're casting lesser restoration, you're using spell slots. So at that point, you don't want to be casting it willy-nilly. You want to be targeting specifically only the people who have it.
That makes sense.
Eliminating the sources, So in this scenario, it becomes very difficult for there to be mass outbreaks of diseases because it can be perfectly detected. I can differentiate between whether or not you have the flu, a cold, allergies, because allergies just isn't going to show up. Like, I know just by looking at
your whole deal.
Yeah, the whole thing. So outbreaks really can't exist.
Wouldn't exist.
Because trivially easy to just quarantine or whatever else people who are sick.
Narratively, on the DM side of things, ostensibly, could there be a magical disease?
I think there'd definitely be room for a plot for like a evil wizard who's created a disease whose only magical component is that it doesn't show up to detect poison and disease, like a silver bullet type of magical disease,
or something like lycanthropy. That's
I think for that to be interesting though, you have to really build into the world that these things already exist. Because if you don't, then I think most people will be like, oh well, so what, the spell doesn't do that because I don't know how useful that spell is anyway.
So I guess the deepening of the world by fully understanding this spell, how do you suggest people deepen their world through analyzing this spell? Well,
so in addition to what we've already talked about, which I think it plenty deepens the world, and this plot hook of maybe somebody nefarious concocting a disease that evades it, you've also got the fact that the existence of this spell helps people create very specific treatments for each disease.
Yeah.
Because suddenly they can differentiate a cold from a flu, and they can figure out what treats a cold and what treats a flu. What's really interesting about the spell is that it facilitates a mundane science. The other thing, which we haven't touched on yet, you could interpret from what we've said, is that this is far beyond anything even modern medicine can do.
Yeah, it's the ultimate CAT scan.
This is perfect. This is perfect diagnosis.
This is a tricorder. This is
exactly. This is a tricorder. In a world where lesser restoration also exists, you'll never die of a disease because this will always be detecting.
As long as you're in a place that has a person with this, right? So remote villages,
right? That's true.
Maybe atheistic civilizations, the settlements that don't believe in any gods and are godless heathens and don't want gods around, and they don't care about gods.
You're really digging on that. I mean, sure. I mean, probably you could be an atheist and still have druids. I would say probably you can even be an atheist and still have clerics.
Hey, if you say so.
But DMs will disagree. Some DMs.
Oh, right, and the rangers, right, who get their magic from.
Well, yeah, I mean, but rangers don't have ritual caster without a feat. So
without a feat, right?
Rangers are in a slightly different situation in regards to this spell.
Am I too hard on rangers, Benjamin?
I don't understand your specific deal with them.
It's a bit. I'm doing a bit.
I also don't care.
Okay,
so
fair enough. Yeah.
So it all shakes out.
Continue.
In the end.
Please continue.
The other thing I was thinking about with this, I came kind of late when I was thinking about it, is that so we've talked about this idea of a ridiculous situation where a cleric is running one way down the street and a whole line of people who may be diseased is running the other direction.
It's like a trolley problem.
Because I don't know if you know what the trolley problem is, if you think that's like the trolley problem.
It's like the trolley problem.
Yeah. Okay. It's not like the trolley problem is all I'm going to say.
Okay. Fair enough. Agree to disagree.
Because in a world where the spell exists, people would have a much better understanding of how diseases spread. They would also know diseases generally can't transmit through barriers.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that old 3 feet of wood.
So this detector person, I mean, probably you wouldn't be doing it through wood. I'm thinking like glass. You could have your detector completely encapsulated, like unable to be infected because of that, and then just detecting people as they come by. The more I thought about this, the more I was like, it's really hard to think through exactly how much the spell would change the world, because
it's so drastic.
Right. And specifically in our modern, in our current context, I think it's easy to think about how it would reduce outbreaks and eliminate that kind of thing. And that's a dream, in a perfect world, we'd love to have this spell so that we could all be avoiding the situation that we're in.
Suddenly the most boring spell in the game becomes the most sought after.
But then it's also like the fact that this is beyond anything modern science and even most fictional versions of science have, in terms of like a perfect diagnosis of it.
Well, and that's why it's divination, right? It's not it's foreseeing what it is. Like, it's almost like you're gonna die this way. Like, I see it in the future.
I guess I would just think this spell must facilitate medicine as a scientific field so much that like surgeries are probably available much sooner than in our world. A whole lot of medical treatment that's probably available at a time that would feel anachronistic in our world.
Suddenly making the medicine skill pertinent, which is
right,
would really change people's games.
Yeah, because I also have never seen anybody I've seen people who don't know what medicine does in the game take medicine, but I've never seen anybody who's played D&D more than once take medicine as a skill.
Yeah, of course not. One thing that we haven't talked about is the skyrocketing cost of U-leaves for people who are going to be casting this spell left and right. Because if you're using a material component, you got to use a U-leaf. And I think that's a really interesting facet.
Like with the trolley car, you are gravely mistaken. The U-leaf is the material component for this. That's true.
Huh?
But if you are a spellcasting class that has any spellcasting focus, you don't have to have.
Oh man, forgot about that focus.
And the U-leaf is not consumed by casting the spell.
Geez, color me embarrassed.
You buy one U-leaf ever, and you can cast
and that's
the spell.
it.
Yeah,
this U-leaf was used by your grandmother.
Exactly. Passed down.
If you break it, we're going to have to get a new one.
And
U-leafs fine. And that's fine. Really there's a yew tree outside. They're right outside.
I guess, is yew tree what that comes from?
Yeah. The yew tree.
I mean, I guess that makes sense.
It's a tree just covered in Benjamin Huffman's. It's a yew tree. See what I did?
I did. I didn't like it, but I saw it.
Well, thank you for making me finally realize that detect poison and disease is a worthwhile spell to take forever and now and forever.
I actually don't know if the lesson is that's worthwhile to take. I think for player characters, it's still not worthwhile. Okay. But in terms of how it impacts the setting, hugely, I would say.
Yeah. And we'd love to hear how you see this spell impact your setting. If there was any bases we didn't cover on this, please let us know. But Benjamin, you got anything to take us out on?
I would just say that this spell is a great example of how something that's not very sexy on the surface, that's not a spell that looks like it directly applies to adventuring. It's still worth thinking about how these spells not only might impact the setting, but how you might find creative ways to make them meaningful and useful on a given adventure.
Great. Like 6 foot wide poison beads.
Exactly.
Great.
This has been Dispel Magic. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again after your next long rest.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Dispel Magic. If this has inspired any ideas for your game, or you have another take on today's topic, please let us know on Twitter @DispelMagicPod. You can find Benjamin @SterlingVermin and Dane @DaneInDanger. Thank you to Slim Mittens for our cover art, produced by Benjamin Huffman, produced and edited by Dane Fox-McGraw.